The English king Henry V married the French princess Catherine of Valois on June 2nd, 1420. The marriage to the daughter of the French king Charles VI was to symbolize his victory over the arch-enemy from the mainland. After all, the marriage was part of the treaty that secured Henry and his heirs the French royal crown after the death of the previous monarch. In fact, the marriage probably cursed English monarchs for generations. At first, things only seemed to get better. Catherine was magnificently crowned queen in England and quickly became pregnant. She bore her husband an heir. However, her husband was not able to enjoy the offspring for long. Henry V died in France on August 31st, 1422. His son was just 9 months old. What no one suspected at the time, however, that was much worse for Henry VI than his father's early death, was his mother's medical history, which was to become a major factor in the Wars of the Roses. For England and its queens and kings, however, it was even worse. Catherine was the progenitor of the Tudor dynasty. She married Owen Tudor in the 1430s and was the great-grandmother of Henry VIII. Catherine's father Charles was nicknamed the Mad, and he had truly earned it. As early as 1392 he attacked his own men with his sword and killed 5 of them. At the time it was assumed that he had suffered from sunstroke and was dehydrated, but things got worse and worse in the years that followed. He regularly forgot his own rank and name. He also no longer recognized his family. He thought his wife was his enemy, even when he knew who she was. He therefore destroyed windows and glasses bearing her coat of arms. In his Paris residence, Charles often ran back and forth until he collapsed from exhaustion. His servants therefore began to lock him up. For months, the king refused to change his clothes, to wash, or to sleep. In one case, one of his servants found him covered in his own feces. This list could go on and on. What is important to know for this video, however, is that Charles' mother already showed similar symptoms. Although Catherine's symptoms are said to have been much less pronounced, they were also present. She died at the age of just 35. Representatives of modern medicine also attribute this to the hereditary disease in the family. This would mean it was a mental as well as a physical illness. But which one was it? Initially, doctors suspected Charles VI had dementia as the symptoms appeared in phases. Later, schizophrenia was considered more realistic as Charles sometimes believed he was made of glass. An initial case of encephalitis or typhoid fever in 1392 is sometimes suspected as the trigger. However, this is only partly consistent with the fact that it was a disease inherited from his mother. Basic catatonic schizophrenia is hereditary and, according to Nigel Bark, matches the symptoms exhibited by Henry VI in 1453. The king collapsed when he learned of a bitter defeat in France. For more than a year he was unresponsive, had to be fed, and reacted little or not at all to external stimuli. Richard of York took advantage of the resulting power vacuum to become Lord Protector. The disaster of the Wars of the Roses took its course. As schizophrenia also fits in with how Henry showed himself in his childhood and youth. His creative streak and his lack of interest in military matters were seen as weaknesses in his time. However, they could also be an expression of his schizophrenia. Alternatively, doctors and historians have also suggested bipolar disorder or autism. However, the latter does not fit with the way Henry later behaved. When Richard Neville's men picked him up, he was wandering around the north of England, disoriented, alone and visibly confused. He never regained his former strength of mind. It is unclear what his physical condition was like. In general, it should be noted that Henry was confined to the tower for years, which must have had an additional mental and physical impact. Henry VIII has traditionally provoked questions about his mental health. He transformed over time from a charismatic and athletic young man into a paranoid and brutal tyrant. Numerous theories have been put forward about this over the years. Diabetes and syphilis are just two of them. However, the doctors Stride and Lopez Floro put forward a different theory in 2013. He had inherited a physical disorder in the Cal-Sileno system from his great-grandmother Jacquetta of Luxembourg. He also suffered from the MacLeod syndrome, which was responsible for his mental changes. Interestingly, Jung and Haker mentioned schizophrenia as a possible manifestation of the syndrome as early as 2004. Later studies confirmed this finding and placed it on a more general level, so perhaps it was in fact the MacLeod syndrome that was passed down through the French royal family into the English dynasties. Finally, we can see the mixture of a psychological and physical illness in Henry's eldest daughter Mary Tudor, who was convinced she was pregnant and eventually died as a result of what she had instead of the pregnancies. Cancer of the uterus is now commonly accepted. As early as 1987, however, Medway convincingly argued that there were too many possible diseases in her case. It was therefore impossible to answer the question. What is certain, however, is that in her case, as with her father, psychological and physical symptoms came together. Mary's younger brother, Edward VI, died at the age of just 15. Fever, progressively developing weakness, and shortness of breath were the symptoms diagnosed by his doctors. The autopsy found 2 putrefied ulcers in his lungs. Tuberculosis was therefore long considered the probable cause of death. His uncle Arthur Tudor, his grandfather Henry VII, and his half-brother, the Duke of Richmond, all suffered from similar symptoms. However, MacLeod syndrome, not to be confused with the pure lung disease Squire James MacLeod syndrome, can also trigger adverse symptoms. However, it is important to bear in mind that there are also opposing opinions in medicine. Kramer, for example, wrote one such opinion in 2012 for the blog The Anne Boleyn Files. There is also a lack of modern research results which would be indispensable for making a diagnosis. It is therefore undoubtedly an exciting experiment to attempt to create a common medical history based on the Catherine of Valois family. However, this quickly leads to overinterpretations, which we should avoid. And yes, I have not forgotten how I called this video. I am guilty of it too. In the end, therefore, we should only make the following statement. It is striking that both Henry VI and many Tudors had to contend with complicated illnesses.